Very few remakes manage to successfully capture the essence of the original game. Whether it's because that game was only amazing in context of when it came out, or because the remake is lacking key elements of the original that were either totally omitted or were recreated poorly. Fortunately, I can say with all honesty, it's my genuine opinion that Dead Space Remake not only captures the spirit of the original game, but improves upon it in almost every possible way, while still being basically the same game that I enjoyed 15 years ago. Remaking a game that most people already consider to be perfect to begin with always runs the risk of changing things that many people don't necessarily feel need to be changed. Fortunately, with the Dead Space remake, most of the changes they did make are to the story itself rather than the gameplay. The story has been tweaked or expanded entirely in multiple different ways. This is noticeable from the moment the game starts. If you've played the original game, you'll notice the very first shot of the intro cutscene is a computer screen similar to like Alien or Aliens, where it delineates the parameters of the rescue mission that they're going on to the Ishimura. And you'll notice in that first shot that it actually lists names for the 2 additional crew members on the Kellion. In the original game, these crew members didn't have names. In the remake, both of these characters, they haven't been totally revamped, although their story has been, although they do now actually have story. Originally in the game, they were just killed off within the first 7 minutes. Now, both of them still die in the first chapter, but their death scenes are a bit more expansive and they have some meaning. One of the characters is actually a recurring enemy throughout the game that is kind of a catalyst for many of the plot events, almost until the end of chapter 9. Nearly all of the existing audio logs and the holograms have been reproduced in higher detail with better audio fidelity, but on top of that, additional backstory has been written for many of the main characters. The entire story of Dead Space itself has been reframed to make it fit into an expanded universe that didn't actually exist at the time the original came out in 2008. So the new story takes into account things that have been established in Dead Space Aftermath, Dead Space Downfall, Dead Space 2, and even Dead Space 3. Dead Space Remake also adds in some side quests revolving around the major characters in the story. Eventually, these side quests grant access to powerful items in locked areas, but the main purpose seems to be to flesh out the relationships between Isaac, Nicole, Dr. Mercer, Dr. Kine, even Captain Matthias, as well as providing some insight into the strained relationship between Isaac and Nicole that precedes the events of the game. It always seemed in the original like he had a lot of issues with guilt over encouraging her to serve on the Ishimura, and we were just supposed to take that basically at face value. But in the remake, they actually have holograms and video calls and audio logs that feature conversations between Isaac and Nicole and add a lot of backstory in, including backstory that shows that their relationship wasn't really perfect before she went to serve on the Ishimura for 6 months. So it helps to explain a lot of how Isaac, or why Isaac feels the way he does, not only in the original, but in the remake and in the sequels. The only other side quest involves locating the senior crew members in order to basically make a master key that opens everything in the entire Ishimura and on the colony. Most of these master security override doors or crates contain either a lot of ammo or weapon upgrades or other items that you can sell to help upgrade your equipment. Weapon upgrades are another additional mechanic in the remake. Originally, the only available improvements to any weapons were normal node upgrades using the Workbench system. Things like ammo capacity, damage, rate of fire, etc. could be upgraded by simply putting nodes into the right slots on the upgrade grid. In addition to the existing upgrades through the node system, each of the 7 weapons has 3 additional upgrades which can either be purchased from the store kiosk or found throughout the ship, or even inside of master security override boxes that become available after finishing all the side quests. These weapon upgrades add secondary effects to the weapons, such as bouncing ricochet blades, burning damage over time, gravity wells, and more. Each weapon upgrade also comes with a free node to be used at the workbench to upgrade the existing stats of your weapons. On the topic of upgrades, compared to the original game, the rig, stasis, and kinesis upgrades are no longer separate categories, but have now been rolled in to the suit upgrade path that's attached to each individual level of your suit. Once the max upgrade has been reached for the suit's level, no additional upgrades can be made until the suit is updated to the next level in the store kiosk. This means that abilities like the oxygen capacity, kinesis range or damage, stasis area of effect, or stasis amount all cannot be upgraded to their maximum until your suit is upgraded to the maximum. Most of the weapons remain the same as the original, where every weapon has an alternate fire mode, although some of them have been changed graphically or the actual fire mode itself has been changed. Specifically, the pulse rifle has been changed to replicate the alternate fire from Dead Space 2, rather than the existing alternate fire in the original. Most of the other guns have just had cosmetic changes to their fire modes, whether it's alternate or the main fire. The only other significant change was to the flamethrower, which now has a different alternate fire, because the original alternate fire really was just the same as the primary. The contact beam has also been changed significantly and works completely differently than the original. Now you can hold down the trigger and it just fires a continuous laser beam, whereas the original forced you to charge the laser up before you could fire it. The majority of Dead Space remains almost identical to the original game, other than one core change: the ability to free roam around the ship. Isaac can now freely travel between areas of the ship unless they are blocked off, which means that the tram station is locked down and cannot be visited by tram until you go there by foot and lower the shutters to enable the tram station. Many areas of the ship are still accessed by a linear progression the first time. An area usually only has one way in and one way out. Returning to an area that has already been cleared will cause you to encounter random enemies due to a new feature known as the Intensity Director, similar to the director in the Left 4 Dead games that adjusts the difficulty on the fly based on how well you're playing. On higher difficulties, deciding whether to revisit areas of the ship can be a gamble, because the new security clearance level system means that there will be areas you can now unlock that you couldn't before that'll have precious ammo or health items in them. But getting there and back again may not be worth the health or ammo required to actually get into the rooms. Conceptually, the intensity director is a great idea, but in the 4 playthroughs I did of the game, it never seemed to make much of a difference or make the game scarier. Either it was obvious there was no way to survive against the amount of enemies it was spawning, or it simply didn't spawn enough enemies to be concerned about. It doesn't take away from the game, but at the most, I think the worst reaction to surprise enemies might have gotten a random "you son of a bitch" when an enemy pops up unexpectedly, but that was it. One of the few actual gameplay changes is that they replaced the existing zero-G mechanics with the zero-G movement mechanics from Dead Space 2 and 3. So now instead of having to aim at a surface and then press a button to execute a jump that you're not able to control, now you just press left stick, L3 or whatever, and you can freely control Isaac 360 degrees. It doesn't really affect how the zero-G sections play, but it is slightly less annoying than having to try to dodge things and then potentially taking damage because you can't actually turn around. The original Dead Space is widely agreed to really only have 2 weak segments in the entire game. Of course, those segments are the ADS cannon, the asteroid defense system in Chapter 4, and later on a similar section where you have to fight the slug, I think it's called, in Chapter 9, Chapter 8, at the end of Chapter 8. Both of them are just kind of lame, and they're kind of arbitrary, where you're just sitting in a cannon, basically a turret defense section. So both of those have been completely recreated. Both of those have been replaced with completely new scenarios that have been fit into the existing game flawlessly, because until those points, the preceding chapters play exactly the same as everyone remembers them. The asteroid defense system, for example, literally is the exact same level, and then you go out the same door, but then instead of having to go down a trench and dodge asteroids, you just go down the trench and calibrate the ADS cannon defense system, and then that's it. You go back inside. So it's similar, minus the actual turret system, or minus the actual turret section. And then the slug is similar to the replaced turret section. It plays very similar, but it's an actual boss fight instead of just sitting in a cannon. As expected with a remake, the major feature is always going to be the leap in technology since the original game was made. So most importantly with Dead Space Remake, the biggest feature here is the graphical change. The original Dead Space was made in a PGA Golf Tour engine, so it's almost a miracle that it even worked in the first place. If you've seen that engine in action in other games, like the actual PGA games. Even so, in that old engine back in 2008, they pulled off some amazing lighting and sound design. So the Dead Space remake has been created in the Frostbite, I believe Frostbite version 3 engine. It's clear that EA Motive put in a lot of passionate work in the process of recreating not just the Ishimura, but every element of this game, especially when it comes to the graphics, the level design, and the sound design, and the lighting. Every bit of the ship looks just as haunting, disgusting, decrepit, dangerous, like an unsafe workplace, and as beautiful as it does in my memories. But obviously it looks leaps and bounds better than the original did in almost every possible way you can identify. The lighting and the modern particle effects recreate many of these areas in stunning detail, even though the lighting doesn't exactly match the original if you did a side-by-side comparison. For instance, the biomass that takes over most of the ship has been updated from the original, and now it actually looks like it's made of flesh and human bodies, and you can even see skulls and body parts sticking out of it in some areas. Not just actual humans sticking out of it, which is also a thing, and they'll grab you if you get too close, but you can see random arms and legs and fingers and stuff. And it adds beautifully grotesque detail to what used to just look like, you know, generic, gross alien stuff. The volumetric effects, like the fog, or even the particle effects like the sparks or the heat distortion from the fire, all looks absolutely beautiful. Even on medium settings, even at 1080p or 1440p, it all looks incredible. And at 4K, some of these screenshots are just unbelievable. Much less seeing the game in action. The sound design especially, one of the tricks of the original Dead Space was that they used sound so brilliantly to keep you creeped out and afraid of what was going to happen. Even though it turned out that once you played the game more and you learned more about how they made it, it turned out that there was nothing to be afraid of. A lot of it was based on kind of funhouse carnival tricks to make you think there was going to be something coming, but there wasn't. For instance, there's this one scene at the very beginning of the game where a necromorph crawls through a vent above you in the hallway leading to the tram repair area. And there's no possibility of it actually coming out of the vent and attacking you because it was just a visual trick. They've actually recreated that in the remake, but then later on in the remake, a necromorph does actually pop out of that vent. I'm not sure if that happened in the original, but I thought that was, you know, it was a clever change if so. But even so, like the sound design also, they amped all those design principles up to like 15. I almost feel like they went overboard on the sound design because you can hear all kinds of ambient stuff. You can hear screaming necromorphs, screaming humans, just all this stuff. And again, most of it ends up not actually existing. But they again did a brilliant job of not making it obvious when that was going to be the case. At one point, I'm not sure if it was even a glitch or if it was intended. During the mining section, it constantly sounds like there's an enemy behind the walls trying to get to you, but you can't ever see an enemy. So to this day, it's confusing whether or not it's a glitch or if it was intended. But they did an absolutely great job at sound design on top of the lighting design and the overall. Although I do highly praise this remake, there are going to be some criticisms I have because that's how we do things here. Most importantly, I played through this game before reviewing on both PlayStation 5 and on PC. The controls on PlayStation 5 were honestly the most difficult part of the game. Not a single thing that I tried to do to adjust the input sensitivity on the sticks, the dead zones, or anything else available in the control section mattered at all. The jumping, the aiming was very jumpy, very inaccurate, And I noticed after about 30 hours that it got worse. It seemed to get worse when the PlayStation 5 had been running for a while. It felt like the controller was desyncing from the console. I was experiencing full input delays of over a second, whereas, you know, just an hour or so earlier, there weren't really any issues. The controller was still very inaccurate, but there wasn't an obvious input delay. So after like an hour or two, it would just eventually crap out. And the funny part is, as soon as I play the game on PC with mouse and keyboard, which is something I would rarely ever do on a third-person shooter, and is doubly funny because the original Dead Space had notorious mouse and keyboard control issues on the PC port. So I was pretty shocked to find out that the mouse input on this game on PC is 100% accurate. It absolutely blows the DualSense out of the water, which was incredible to me. I never would have expected that a game made to be played with a controller would be such a pain in the ass to actually play with a controller. And it wasn't just, again, I promise, it wasn't just issues with the input delay or with the joysticks not moving when they're supposed to. The quote-unquote DS1 control scheme, that's one of the preloaded defaults in the game, is broken in this remake. If you actually look at the controls, they do not work and they do not make sense. So for instance, when you go into the UI to use the map, one of the buttons to change floors specifically on the map is triangle, except triangle is also the same button to open the inventory. So anything that's assigned to triangle, when you're already in the UI, it just closes the inventory. Again, I promise, this is the default DS1 control scheme. Not the default scheme itself, but the scheme that was meant to recreate the controls from the original game. And then on top of that, there are plenty of other functions that are supposed to be mapped to buttons like this, like the inventory, at least on the Dead Space 1 preset. Otherwise, it'll just close the inventory. Another example is the key items menu inside the regular inventory screen is bound by default to Y or triangle, which would show you quest items that don't actually take up inventory space, such as the shock pad or the hydrazine canister or whatever else. However, you can't look at them because the button to actually look at the key items is the same as the button to open the inventory, at least on the Dead Space 1 preset. Otherwise, it'll just close the inventory. You can kind of finagle it into working, but you have to press the inventory, then you have to hold the button and then kind of mess with it. Most of these issues are resolved in the Dead Space 2 preset, so the first of many times I'd have to ask, why was there a Dead Space 1 preset to begin with? Because there's a difference between offering players an option to control the game the way that they're used to, and offering players a way to control the game that actually works. Even as a Dead Space 1 purist, I would far rather have a control scheme that actually works versus one that's nostalgic. Maybe that's just me. You'll notice that even though there's a control technically set in the settings for use stasis pack, it doesn't actually work, even on the PC version. So if you look, you can see it's supposed to be Y, allegedly. But when you actually try to use it, it doesn't work and just opens the inventory each time. You can see there are obviously stasis packs in the inventory. It just does not use stasis. However, if you're playing with mouse and keyboard, then you can just press C and it uses the stasis pack. So the PC version suffers from the same control issues, even though there's allegedly a way around it. Obviously, the solution would be not to use the Dead Space 1 control scheme, but then once again, why is it there if it doesn't actually work? One of, if not probably the only real criticism I have is that this game released without a photo mode. To most people, that's probably irrelevant. They probably don't really care, and it's definitely not a deal breaker. But in 2023, it's kind of weird to not have a photo mode in a AAA game that you spent, God knows how much money making, especially when it's a remake and the core reason for this to exist is the graphical upgrade. It just seems antithetical to release a game where the primary draw is the graphics and then not put in a photo mode so people can, appreciate the graphics. And it's not like Dead Space is the only game that's done this year, much less ever. Hogwarts Legacy didn't have a photo mode and still doesn't. I'm not even surprised either that EA Motive ignored everyone that asked about photo mode. I personally asked for it for at least a year since the moment they revealed the first teaser trailer. On Twitter, I posted pretty frequently, will I have photo mode? I never personally got an answer. They had a Reddit AMA a couple weeks ago, and multiple people asked about photo mode. Not a single one of them was addressed. They've never said yes or no. They've never even addressed the question. It would be great to have one. If you're on PC, fortunately, there's a guy on Patreon that mods basically every game that comes out and adds a photo mode, or he adds one that doesn't suck in the case of games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and a lot of others, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And I wouldn't even say the Odyssey photo mode sucks. It's actually really good. But so far, there's no official word on them actually adding one that's built into the game. Other than the lack of photo mode, there are two other complaints I have actually, which are conveniently displayable at the same time. The first is the fact that the laser pointer system in the game, in the remake, is completely different from the original. In the original game, every single weapon had a laser sight that was projected from the weapon model infinitely until it hit a wall. And if it didn't hit a wall, then it just went on forever, but you couldn't actually see it, obviously, because it was, 85 kilometers away. In the remake, they have a laser system, but it only extends about 1.5 feet from the gun model, and then it just turns into a free floating crosshair. For the majority of the game, it really isn't a big deal, although there is a little idiosyncrasy. Like in the original game, if your laser pointer intercepted a wall, because there were 3 of them on every gun, it was still possible to actually shoot past the wall if one of the laser pointers was unobstructed. But in the remake, if any of them touch a wall, the projectile just stops in midair. It just ceases to go anywhere. Again, it's really not a big deal, but it's just annoying. I understand they couldn't figure out how, or they just physically couldn't remake that system in Frostbite. And really the only time that it is a big deal is at the last boss, the Hive Mind, which is the other issue I have with the game. The one thing in the game that really should have been changed was the Hive Mind boss fight. And it's the one thing in the game, one of the few things, but the one boss in the game that's 100% the same, almost. Like, almost entirely exactly the same as the original. Down to the animations, down to the hive mind's movement, even the three phases of the fight. But most importantly, tying into the laser sight problem is that once it picks you up, it's basically impossible to see where you're aiming, even with the laser sight. So that doesn't really make a difference. The floating crosshair just makes it worse. But even with the laser sight, you still couldn't really tell what the hell you were doing because there's just so much movement all the time in that fight. So again, that's like the one thing that I had hoped they would fix, and they really just left it the same. Normally I don't put this kind of stuff in reviews, but I thought that Dead Space, or rather EA Motive, actually did a pretty decent job of putting in accessibility options. So you've got menu narration, similar to like Windows, where it'll read out loud what the menu option you're highlighting is, if you're hard of hearing. And then you can customize the volume on that. There are 3 different color blind modes for Protanopia, Deuteranopia, and Tritonopia. Funny enough, like, it feels like using the Protanopia setting is actually how the game is supposed to look. Versus the default is a lot more red and green. Really a lot more red, I guess. And then the Tritonopia obviously is if you have issues seeing blue. In addition to that, I don't understand why these settings exist, and I personally don't think they should exist because it's a horror game. But there are settings to like show content warning and even hide scenes that could like trigger people, because the game does feature a lot of violence, and I guess sensitive topics like suicide and stuff. Then, of course, it also has a lot of your standard accessibility features like sprint toggle or single press QuickTime events, which were a thing in Last of Us Part 1, I know for sure, because I used them. And that just makes it easier. You just hold a button instead of mashing a button, which, you know, is very common in video games. Now you can just hold a button. And of course, you've got a lot of other stuff like menu motion. It will make the menu static instead of make it move around. Subtitles, you can actually make the subtitles this huge on screen, and you can control whether or not they're in all caps, or white on black, black on white, or, you know, background opacity. It'll also let you set a color for the character that's speaking. You can also turn off camera shake entirely when you're shooting or when you get injured or whatever. And on top of that, it has completely completely remappable controls on PC and on console. And then you got your standard, your standard sensitivity settings and all that. The one thing I would note is that both on console and on PC, you cannot turn off chromatic aberration. It's impossible, at least through the game. I haven't tried through an INI file. You can turn off motion blur. And then you've got your normal settings. Also film grain. You can turn off film grain, but the chromatic aberration is one thing you can't turn off, and there isn't like a all-in-one post-processing setting either. One other extremely annoying thing I noticed that only applies to PC. A lot of games have this problem lately. Halo Infinite is the main culprit. I remember vividly how annoying it was. For whatever reason, the Nvidia overlay doesn't cooperate with the in-game interface. So, like, if you're already in a menu and you turn on Nvidia share, I don't know if it records through the video, but you can see it's literally impossible to actually move the mouse or do anything. So the only solution is to mess with the overlay while you're like actually in game, start recording, and then close the overlay and then go into the menus. Then you can move the mouse. Otherwise, if you try to have overlapping interfaces here that use the mouse, neither one of them will work. That's an issue that's never been resolved on Halo Infinite, and I doubt that it's ever going to be fixed in this game. I apologize for the length of this video, so let me just try to wrap this up as quick as I can. I was very reticent to get my hopes up for this game or to even purchase it at all based on what had been shown about a year ago, when they first revealed, or when they first confirmed the remake. That said, now that it's been out for a few weeks, I bought Deluxe Edition on both PC and PlayStation, and my only regret is that I didn't get the Collector's Edition and that I don't have it on Xbox as well. A lot of people like to cite the Resident Evil 2 remake as, a perfect remake. They're wrong, for one thing, but this remake is exactly what a remake should be. They didn't add a bunch of stuff that no one wants. They didn't significantly change things that didn't need to be changed. All they did was improve an existing game that was already amazing, and they made it that much better. This really is the gold standard of what a remake should be moving forward. When you compare it to things like Last of Us Part 1, where they literally didn't change anything at all other than some animations, and a remake like Resident Evil Remake 3, where they cut out over half the game and most of the game mechanics on top of that. This is the sweet spot in the middle. This is exactly what every developer should be doing when they remake a game. So, that said, if you're a fan of Dead Space, any of the Dead Space games, even if you haven't played Dead Space 1, but especially if you are and you have played Dead Space 1, you definitely need to get this game because it's amazing. That's it. Peace, folks.